Alright, we talked yesterday about physical and chemical properties and physical and chemical changes and comparing and contrasting the two of those. Today we have another distinction of different types of properties that you'll need to know, and that is extensive versus intensive properties. Alright, and these aren't mutually exclusive with physical and chemical properties. You can have physical properties that are extensive or intensive, right? It's just another classification. Sorry about the dog again. Alright, so looking at the definitions of these two terms, an intensive property is one that does not depend on the amount of the substance that you have. So what that means basically is it doesn't matter how much you have of this chemical, this property is going to be the same no matter if you have 1 teaspoonful or a gallon. Okay, and an extensive property is the opposite. Oops, let me move my face out of the way. Okay, an extensive property is the opposite. It's one that does depend on the amount. So this is something where if you have more of it, that property might change. All right, and we're going to look at examples of both of these. So just some more info here. Intensive properties are determined by the chemical composition of the particles and their structure. So what chemicals or what types of elements are in the compound you're talking about and how they're arranged. So you can see here the difference between diamond, which is all carbon but it's arranged in this crystal structure, versus graphite, which is still all carbon but instead of being all bound together with covalent bonds, it's made in layers. So that's why when you write, layers of it will scrape off of your pencil and remain on the paper. So the intensive property there is the difference between those properties is caused by the difference in how these atoms are arranged. Okay, and then extensive properties don't depend on how the atoms are arranged or their chemical composition or anything like that. It just depends on how much of it you have. So here we've got 7 blocks on one side and 3 on the other, so the scale tips one way because there's more on this side. Alright, the only thing that changes the volume of these balloons in this example is the amount of particles that are in one. This one has more particles, so the balloon is bigger. Alright, those are examples of extensive properties. We don't care what kind of particles are in there, just how many of them there are. Okay, so here as we go through and look at these different examples of properties, I'm going to pause the video and ask y'all questions in Edpuzzle, and I want you guys to take a shot at whether these properties are each extensive or intensive. Okay, so the first one, color, is how an object absorbs and reflects light. Do you think that matters how much of something you have? Or is something going to be the same color whether you have a little bit of it or a lot of it? Okay, the next one, texture. How does it look and how does it feel? Is that extensive? Is it affected by how much of it you have? Or is something going to have the same texture no matter how much of it you have? And in that case, it would be intensive. Okay, mass, the amount of matter in an object. Does the mass of something change when you have more of it? Be extensive, or does it stay the same when you get more of that substance, which would mean it was intensive? Okay. Volume, the amount of space an object occupies, extensive or intensive. Alright, density. This one's a little tricky, so I'm just going to tell you guys this one. So density is the ratio of mass to volume, which means how tightly packed particles in the substance are. Right, and if we wanted to find it mathematically, it's always going to be the mass divided by the volume is equal to the density. And this is one where it is an intensive property because it does not matter whether I have a gallon of water or an ounce of water. Water is always going to be the same density. It's always going to have the same mass per volume, and that's 1 gram per milliliter. All right. So having more of a substance doesn't change its density, so it is an intensive property. Alright, luster, the way that a substance reflects light, whether it's metallic or non-metallic or glassy or dull or matte colored or however you want to describe it. Does it change when you have more of it or less of it, or is it independent of how much of that substance you have? Extensive or intensive? Ductility, the ability of a substance to be stretched into a wire. Extensive or intensive? Alright, and malleability, which is the ability of a substance to be hammered flat and retain the new shape. So you've got your example here of a metal being beaten on an anvil. Once he hammers that flat, it's not going to spring back to its old shape. It's stay in that shape. So it is malleable. Is that going to change based on how much metal he's hammering? Or is it the same whether it's a big chunk or a little chunk? Alright, so if you noticed, all those ones we talked about previously were physical properties, if you could kind of tell from yesterday's lecture. That's because all chemical properties are intensive. They don't matter whether you have a ton of them, a ton of the substance, or just a little bit. Its chemical properties are going to be the same, because chemical properties are all based off of the chemical compound of the substance, like we talked about at the very beginning on this slide. Right, so chemical properties are all based off of the chemical composition and the structure of the particles, so they are all intensive properties. Alright, and that's it for today. Nice short lessons. You guys can get all caught up with the rest of your work.